Hi there, my name is Dr. Buckley, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this lecture video, which will discuss sensory memory and the persistence of sensory information over time. So when cognitive psychology was still in its infancy or relatively new, researchers proposed that the first stage of the human information processing system, right, and this was shortly after the cognitive revolution, right, they proposed that the first stage of human information processing is sensory memory. And they posited that sensory memory allows for all information to be available for processing, but only a subset of the information to be selected for processing. So let's imagine that you are walking into a room and you forgot your smartwatch, and so you're desperately kind of searching for the clock to see if you'll be late for a particular class, right? So you walk into the room and there's all kinds of people milling around. There's all sorts of noise and clutter in the room. There's pictures and posters up on the walls. Okay, so all of that information is in your visual sensory memory. Okay, but the only information that's relevant to you is going to be the clock on the wall that tells you what time it is, right? So sensory memory is a very brief, temporary store where all of your encoding sensory information is stored so that you can decide what among that sensory information is most relevant to you and focus on that, right? In essence, that's what sensory memory was assumed to be. So sensory memory was assumed to be modality specific. So a given representation was thought to contain information from only one sense, right? So initially, when researchers started to study sensory memory, they assumed that we have one sensory memory for vision, which would be iconic memory or iconic sensory memory, another sensory register for sound, so auditory sensory memory, which is echoic memory, and then different sensory registers or different sensory memories for other senses as well, like smell, taste, touch. Together, these sensory memory stores were referred to as sensory registers. And the most widely studied of those sensory registers were your visual sensory memory or iconic memory. And that's the register containing visual information, right? And echoic memory for incoming auditory information. So what we're going to talk about for the rest of this lecture is iconic memory or visual sensory memory and echoic memory, which is your sensory memory register for auditory information. So the term iconic memory was inspired by the results of a series of experiments conducted by George Sperling in 1960. So Sperling 1960 began his examination of iconic memory by asking participants to report as many letters as possible from a briefly presented display consisting of 3 rows of 4 letters, such as the one shown in the figure. The 50 millisecond presentation was so brief that it appeared only as a flicker to participants, and this became known as Sperling's whole report paradigm. So Sperling found that participants were only able to report, on average, about 4.6 out of the 12 letters in the whole report paradigm. So Sperling 1960 supposed there was 2 explanations for this effect. participants only saw 4.6 letters because the presentation was so brief, or participants could only report 4.6 letters before their visual sensory memory faded. So to test which of those two possible explanations it was, Sperling devised the partial report paradigm. So in the original partial report paradigm, participants were presented with 3 rows of 4 letters, such as we see in the second panel of the figure, for about 50 seconds. And then after a delay ranging from 0 to 1000 milliseconds, the participant was presented with a tone indicating which row of letters to report. A high tone indicating the top row, a mid-range tone indicating the middle row, and a low tone indicating the lowest row. The logic was that the capacity of iconic memory could be quantified as the number of letters a person can report from a randomly chosen row multiplied by the number of possible rows. If the whole report performance was the result of only being able to see 4.6 of the 12 letters, then performance on the partial report task should be 4.6 divided by 3, or 1.3 letters per trial. However, if the whole report score was because of a rapidly fading memory, partial report scores should be significantly higher than the whole report scores for the duration of iconic memory. And indeed, at Q delays of up to about 500 milliseconds, Sperling found a partial report advantage. Participants reported 3.4 out of 4 possible letters on average for a partial report score of about 11. So if we multiply the 3.4 by 3, we get 11 compared to the whole report score of 4.6. So essentially, Sperling discovered that what resided in the iconic sensory memory register was the entire 4 by 3 array of letters, and the reason that people could only report 4.6 out of 12 in that case is because even though they have a mental image in iconic sensory memory of the entire image, it rapidly decays or is rapidly forgotten after 500 milliseconds. So as the participant is reporting the letters out loud, the mental image of the array is evaporating essentially, or being rapidly forgotten. So the partial report, because participants received the tone and were able to report any row in the array, that suggests that at least initially they have access to the whole array. It's just that by the time they get to about 3 or 4 letters, the array is gone, right? So as I mentioned previously, the partial report advantage was observed up to Q delays of about 500 milliseconds, at which point participants reported about the same number of items in the partial and whole report conditions. So the duration of the partial report advantage led Sperling to conclude that A, for a brief period of time, most visual information is available to participants, and B, after about 500 milliseconds, only a subset of the information is available. Right? So Sperling inferred that iconic memory or visual sensory memory has an unlimited capacity, but a duration of about 500 milliseconds. Right? So essentially what that means is your visual sensory memory, the register that holds on to that information, has an unlimited capacity. So basically, as much sensory input as your eyeballs can see That's how much information is stored in your iconic sensory memory register. However, it's only actually in there for a very small amount of time. So after 500 milliseconds, which is basically like a flicker, guys, it's like nothing, the entire image disappears. So Sperling also found that presenting a bright flash of light immediately after the presentation of the array eliminated participants' ability to report items. Sperling concluded that because the material in iconic memory could be effectively erased with the flash of a light, the material must be perceptual in nature or pre-categorical. That is, not yet identified as specific numbers or letters. Sperling reasoned that if material in iconic memory had been processed to a point of being identified as either specific numbers or letters, or if it was post categorical, then the material could be rehearsed. And if it could be rehearsed, then some of the items could be reported even following the flash of light. But because the flash of light eliminated the sensory memory store, Sperling proposed that the best way to conceptualize visual sensory memory or iconic memory is as a store comprised of rapidly fading pre-categorical stimuli that have not yet been identified as a certain letter, number, or object. Because once an object is identified as an A or a 2 or a dog, it is considered categorical. So Sperling 1960 also made claims about the nature of information in iconic memory, arguing that iconic memory only contained perceptual information and that icons or stimuli in iconic memory needed to be scanned to extract categorical information, such as whether it's a letter or a number. So basically, by pre-categorical, essentially what Sperling meant is raw, unprocessed sensory information. So it's basically just residual neural activity in the somatosensory cortex that the brain has failed to interpret as belonging to a particular category, such as a number or a letter or a word or what have you. Although many experiments have replicated Sperling's findings, a plethora of experimental evidence contradicts the concept of iconic memory or visual sensory memory as a rapidly fading pre-categorical memory store that is independent from other short-term memory stores. So first, multiple experiments have demonstrated that some categorical information, such as whether the item is a letter or a number, or whether the item is a vowel or a consonant, is available even when an array is presented only briefly. So Miracle 1980 demonstrated that even when you presented the visual array very quickly, around 500 milliseconds, people could still indicate what type of stimulus it was, whether it was a letter or a number. Which calls into question the notion that iconic memory is pre-categorical. Right? If people can identify the category of the stimuli, that means it must not just be raw sensory information, it must also have been processed in some way. Second, some of the partial report advantage is used as evidence for iconic memory might actually be the result of output interference. So what is output interference? Output interference occurs when the very act of reporting or recalling distorts memories or allows material in short-term memory to be lost. So whole report trials are more affected by output interference because these trials require more output. So the maximum number of letters that can be reported on a whole report trial is 12, while the maximum on a partial report is 4. So with output interference is reducing the amount of letters reported on a whole report test or whole report trials, then this would in turn make the partial report advantage seem larger and more rapidly changing than it actually is. So the notion of iconic memory clearly predicts a large partial report advantage. Third, several studies have shown that identity, or being able to identify information as being a letter or number in the partial report task, lasts much longer than location information. So people are much better at identifying what type of stimulus it is than where it occurred in the array, which indicates that information in iconic memory is not well described as fading, right, rapidly, as different aspects of the information tend to fade at different rates. So thus, there is experimental evidence calling into question that iconic memory or visual sensory memory is pre-categorical, that iconic memory is sort of vast and rapidly fading, and that the information in iconic memory is essentially a duplicate of a visual stimulus in rapidly fading form, right? So in essence, what does that mean? Well, Sperling made the claim, right, that what's happening in visual sensory memory is the mind is creating a complete snapshot of everything that we perceive by our eyes, right? All of the visual information that our receptors are currently picking up in our environment is temporarily registered in our sensory memory. But that representation in our sensory memory is rapidly forgotten, right? So it's only in our brains for about 500 milliseconds, right? So really, what are the criticisms? Well, the criticisms are that another way to explain the difference between partial report and whole report, right? So one explanation is that with partial report, the participant has enough time to report all of the letters in a row before it's forgotten. Whereas with the whole report, trying to report all of the letters, the picture in your sensory memory is erased well before you get to the last letter, right? But another explanation of that is something called output interference. So basically, if I were to ask you, for example, to write down all of the capitals of all 50 states, right? So starting with Georgia, Virginia, California, North Dakota, all of those things, write down all of the state capitals until you get to 50, right? Output interference, what happens with output interference is as you write down those initial state capitals, right, you're going to keep thinking about those state capitals, and the ones that you've already written down are going to become so prominent in your memory that it's harder for you to access the other items, if that makes sense. So basically, the output interference explanation says that during whole report, where there's an array of 12 letters, once you write down those 4.6 letters, okay, those 4.6 letters that you've already written down are going to become so prominent in your mind that you have a harder time remembering the other 7.4 or whatever letters. As opposed to when you only have to report one row, that's only a total of 4 letters, right? So because you only have a pool of 4 letters instead of a pool of 12 letters, you're going to experience less output interference, right? So one criticism of Sperling's research is that he's saying the reason why we have that difference between whole versus partial report is because you run out of time to report the letters because the picture in your sensory memory is gone. Whereas other people are saying, well, I can explain that exact same pattern where people remember more letters in the partial report case than the whole report case simply through output interference. Okay? The other criticism is the pre-post categorical thing, right? So Sperling is saying the information that resides in your sensory memory, your visual sensory memory or your iconic sensory memory, is basically just neural signals. It's unprocessed sensory information. So it comes into your eyeball as just a bunch of electrical impulses. And your brain has not yet decided, okay, or has not yet coded, if you will, those raw electrical signals into like meaningful things, like a letter versus a number or a picture, right? Or a word or whatever. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it's not just raw electrical signals in your iconic sensory memory. And the evidence to suggest that it's not is that if you flash a set of an array for about 500 seconds that has both letters and numbers, and then instead of asking people to report by row, you ask them report all of the letters or all of the numbers. This is the study that um, Miracle in 1980 showed, is that if you ask people to report, okay, which of those are numbers and which of those are letters, even if they're only presented very briefly, people can do that, right? So that suggests that information and iconic sensory memory isn't entirely pre-categorical and it's been processed to some extent, okay? So hopefully this makes sense, but if it doesn't, you are absolutely more than welcome to contact me and we can go through it together. So now that we've talked about laboratory studies, there are many real-world situations where decisions must be made based on visual information that appears only briefly, right? So for example, in the past, our evolutionary ancestors would have had to decide how to act based on brief flashes of animals in the wild, while even in present day, we often have to make choices based on information flashed very briefly on a video screen, for example. And in these situations, when stimuli are seen and disappear, people must rely on visual sensory memory to make those decisions. So Alexandra Vlasova and Joel Pearson of the University of New South Wales were interested in better understanding how people use visual sensory memory to help them make decisions. So in particular, the researchers were curious whether the visual information would continue to influence decision making after the stimulus was no longer present or available. So in their 2013 experiment, Vlasova and Pearson presented participants with a 250 millisecond array of randomly moving dots that were drifting to the right or to the left. And the array was followed by either a mask that would disrupt sensory memory or a blank screen that would not disrupt sensory memory. A tone sounded after a delay, which signaled participants to indicate as quickly and accurately as possible which way the stimuli were moving. So Vlasova and Pearson found that participants made more accurate decisions when the stimulus was followed by a blank screen than when the stimulus was followed by a mask. And that this accuracy advantage is increased as response delay increased. So Vlasova and Pearson conclude that participants use sensory memory when it is available to improve their decision-making processes, specifically their accuracy and the quality of the information extracted from sensory memory improves with a delay of up to about 500 milliseconds. So collectively, these results suggest that when real world decisions must be made are based on sensory memory, people will be more accurate if they pause before making a choice. So, in essence, next time you're tracking animals in the woods or making split decisions on a computer screen, for example, or you need to repeatedly make choices based on what you see, you may decide to adopt a more hesitant strategy to take advantage of your sensory memory, specifically your iconic sensory memory's natural tendency to improve with time and to make your decision making more accurate. So, echoic memory is a term frequently used to describe a brief pre-categorical auditory memory store that holds all incoming auditory information long enough for the listener to select and further process information of value. So, very much conceptually, echoic memory is identical to iconic memory. The only difference between them is that echoic memory corresponds to auditory information, whereas iconic memory corresponds to visual information. So some studies of echoic memory have been very similar conceptually to studies of iconic memory. So researchers have presented large amounts of auditory information and then compared participants' ability to identify the items in the partial and whole report conditions. So, for example, Darwin, Turvey, and Crowder in 1972 presented auditory lists of numbers so that they were heard as coming from the left, the center, or the right of the listener. So with headphones, it would be left, right, and then in the center. And after list presentation, a visual cue was presented to indicate either left, center, or right. So which list they were supposed to report. Or instead, participants had to report as many items from any list as they could. So it was basically partial report versus whole report. And in these experiments, Darwin and colleagues found a partial report advantage at short cue delays and attributed this finding to echoic memory, which they purported was similar to iconic memory, a large modality-specific pre-categorical store for auditory information. And the partial report advantage was smaller than that for iconic memory, but otherwise they were very similar to each other. So, in an experiment conducted by Conrad and Hull in 1968, participants were presented with a list of numbers and had to read the list either out loud or silently. And what they found is that when they examined recall accuracy as a function of serial position, um, they found what they called a modality effect. So when participants read the items out loud during the trial, they were better at remembering the last two items on the list than they were when they did not read the items out loud. So this modality effect was attributed to echoic memory, and Morton, Crowder, and Presson in 1971 explored echoic memory by looking at the impact of adding a suffix to auditory stimuli, and then they plotted the accuracy of recall as a function of serial position. And in one condition, they added a buzzer sound as a suffix, and in the other condition, they added a speech sound as a suffix. And essentially, what they found is that memory for the last item was near perfect when the suffix was a buzzer, but was significantly lower when the suffix was a speech sound. So this suffix effect was thought to be the result of speech-like suffixes interfering with echoic memory. And so Crowder and Morton, 1969, proposed the pre-categorical acoustic store model, or the PASS model, to account for the suffix effect and the modality effect. So the PASS model was essentially the same as Neisser's concept of echoic memory, a large capacity, pre-categorical, modality-specific memory store that lasted for about 2 seconds. And again, a lot of these effects reflect the fact that echoic memory is auditory in nature, and is therefore influenced by interfering information such as speech sounds. Sorry about that. I just wanted to reiterate. I didn't realize that I broke the slides down further. But Morton, Crowder, and Presson in 1971 investigated echoic memory by looking at the impact of adding a suffix to auditory stimuli, and then they plotted the accuracy of the recall. So in one condition, they had a buzzer noise as the suffix, and then in the other condition they added a speech sound as the suffix, and they found that memory for the last item was unaffected at the buzzer suffix, but was significantly affected by the speech sound. And it was thought that speech sounds interfere with echoic memory. And similarly here, just to reiterate about the PASS model. So the PASS model was proposed by Crowder and Morton in 1969, and it basically was a model to account for the suffix effect and the modality effect. And it was basically the same as Neisser's concept for echoic memory. So it was a large capacity, pre-categorical, modality-specific memory store that lasted for about 2 seconds. So as with iconic memory or visual sensory memory, a variety of experimental evidence contradicts the concept of echoic memory as a rapidly forgotten or rapidly fading modality-specific pre-categorical memory store that is independent from other short-term memory stores. So the biggest problem with echoic memory is the notion that it is pre-categorical. So very similar to the pattern of results we talked about with iconic sensory memory, Neath and colleagues in 1993 demonstrated that the suffix effect could be created or eliminated with identical suffix stimuli, depending on whether the listener was told the suffix was a speech sound or an animal sound in advance. If a pre-categorical modality-specific acoustic store was the only cognitive process being used to recall the items, then the results should have been the same in both conditions, but that wasn't the case. Similarly, Spoor and colleagues in 1978 showed a suffix effect when the listener saw the participant's mouth move, or when the listener saw the reader mouth the suffix but did not actually hear the suffix. Again, if the serial recall of items was being accomplished through a modality-specific pre-categorical store, then there should have been no suffix effect when the suffix was mouthed but not heard. But it occurred both times, when it was just mouthed silently and when it was heard. So the previous discussions call into question whether the notion that we possess a high capacity pre-categorical memory store for either visual or auditory stimuli. So how can we explain the ability to report stimuli that are no longer present? One possibility is that iconic memory and echoic memory are just artifacts of two other phenomena, such as stimulus persistence and information persistence. So stimulus persistence is residual neural activity produced by the presentation of a stimulus, and it fades quickly over time. So because we process different modalities with different parts of the brain, stimulus persistence is modality specific, right? So visual stimulus persistence has been studied in the visual modality using temporal integration paradigms. So with these experiments, such as those conducted by Loftus and Irwin in 1998, two stimuli are presented with varying interstimulus intervals, or ISIs. And the participant indicates those trials where the stimuli appear distinct, okay, such as at the bottom of the panel there, or the cases where they appear to be a single shape, right? And stimulus persistence is estimated by noticing the longest interstimulus interval between two stimuli, where the two stimuli appear as one. Okay, so basically, for a relatively short interstimulus interval, they will be perceived as an integrated object, whereas for longer ones, they'll be perceived as two separate objects. So the results from these studies suggest that stimulus persistence is very brief and is estimated to last around 200 milliseconds in ideal conditions. And this cannot be used to explain the partial report advantage in iconic memory experiments. In temporal integration paradigms, two halves of a shape may be presented at varying interstimulus intervals. At short intervals, the stimuli appear as one. At longer interstimulus intervals, the stimuli appear to be distinct. So temporal integration is evidence for a brief period of stimulus persistence, but its fleeting nature discounts the typical descriptions of iconic memory, right? So basically, stimulus persistence is kind of similar in essence to the pre-categorical argument, right? So it's kind of the idea that what we experience as iconic memory is raw neural activity or residual neural activity that is produced by the presentation of a stimulus and fades very quickly over time. And because we process modalities with different parts of the brain, stimulus persistence is modality specific. So stimulus persistence has also been studied for auditory stimuli. So for example, Efren 1970 presented participants with tones of varying durations between 30 milliseconds and 100 milliseconds and asked the participant to adjust a light so that it came on as soon as the tone ended. And what they found is that no matter how long the actual tone lasted, participants perceived the tone as being at least 130 milliseconds in duration. What this strongly suggests is that when a tone is presented, it continues to persist for about 100 milliseconds. So even after the tone is no longer being presented in the environment, the residual neural activity caused by the initial perception of the stimulus lingers, if you will, and that residual neural activity creates the perception of the sound that's no longer there. So the original notion of sensory memory was that multiple modality-specific sensory registers held pre-categorical information until it was selected for processing. The consensus was that iconic memory lasted about 1 second at the very most, and echoic memory lasted about 3 seconds at the most. Initial research using partial report paradigms for both visual information and auditory information seemed to support this notion. However, more recent experimental evidence suggests that the initial hypothesis about sensory memory were incorrect, and there is simply no evidence for a long-lasting pre-categorical memory in any modality. So instead, we experience stimulus persistence only briefly after the presentation of a stimulus, and it shouldn't actually be considered memory, more so than an after image created, for example, by rubbing your eyes should be considered a memory. So another interesting question is, what are the parts of the brain that correspond to iconic memory? Well, there's a lot of insights on this, right? So brain lesion studies have looked at patients with damage to the occipital lobe, and particularly the primary visual cortex, or V1. And they often show impairments in both visual processing and iconic sensory memory. This indicates that V1, or the primary visual cortex, plays a crucial role in maintaining visual information even when the stimulus is no longer present. Neuroimaging studies. So functional MRI or fMRI studies show activation in the primary visual cortex as well as the extrastriate areas, V1, V2, V3, and V4, during tasks that require retention of visual information that's no longer present. So these areas remain active during the brief period when visual information is retained in iconic memory. For example, studies showing visual stimuli presented briefly followed by a delay have shown sustained activity in these regions even after the stimuli or the visual stimulus is no longer present. We also have electrophysiological evidence. So, for example, remember event-related potentials, right, or ERPs from my last video? So basically, researchers used ERPs recorded via EEG to demonstrate specific patterns of brain activity associated with the encoding and retention of briefly presented visual stimuli. And components like P1 and N1 are linked to early visual processing, while later components are linked with short-term retention of visual information. So something that you would find in short-term or working memory, for example. Neural substrates of echoic or auditory sensory memory are similar. So patients with damage to the superior temporal gyrus, and especially the primary auditory cortex, often exhibit deficits in auditory processing and memory. And this suggests that these regions are going to be critical for the initial encoding and brief storage of auditory information. So lesions in an area known as the planum temporale are associated with impairments in processing not only simple auditory stimuli, but also fairly complex auditory stimuli, which further supports the primary auditory cortex as being critical in the development of echoic memory. Neuroimaging studies. So both fMRI and PET studies show activation in the primary and secondary auditory cortices or auditory cortexes during tasks requiring auditory retention. So these regions are particularly active when participants engage in tasks that require them to hold auditory information for very short periods of time. Activation in the medial nucleus and the thalamus has also been observed, indicating that they play a critical role in both retaining and retrieving auditory information from sensory memory. And again, electrophysiological evidence. So with EEG and MEG studies, we look at ERPs. And they reflect the brain's automatic response to changes in auditory stimuli, suggesting that because our brains are able to detect these very brief stages and or changes in auditory stimuli, the auditory stimulus must at least temporarily still be registered in these brain areas, even when it's no longer present. And the sustained auditory response in EEG studies observed as prolonged neural activity after an auditory stimulus has stopped indicates that the auditory cortex is responsible for maintaining that auditory information even after the stimulus is gone. So one of the most critical things about sensory memory is that it can be utilized as or sensory memory deficits rather, can appear early in the course of Alzheimer's disease, even before obvious symptoms of of memory impairment and cognitive decline emerge. So sensory memory is invaluable as a diagnostic tool for Alzheimer's disease. Also, tests of sensory memory can be part of a battery of cognitive assessments to detect early changes in the brain, changes in brain function. And even for mental health disorders or psychopathology, such as schizophrenia, schizophrenia often involves deficits in sensory processing and memory. So, tasks that measure iconic and echoic memory can reveal impairments in the early stages of sensory processing and integration, which are characteristics of schizophrenia. And also ERPs like the P300 wave, which is related to attention and memory processing, can show, for example, abnormalities in patients with schizophrenia during sensory memory tasks. Parkinson's disease can affect sensory memory and sensory processing through its though it is primarily a motor disorder, sensory memory tests can help detect some of those cognitive impairments and track the progression of the disease with respect to its non-motor symptoms. Individuals with ADHD may show deficits in sensory memory due to issues with attention, like we talked about before, the P300, and executive function. Testing iconic and echoic memory can help identify specific sensory processing deficits and contribute to a comprehensive diagnosis. Interestingly enough, we can even use tests of iconic and echoic memory to look at how major depressive disorder influences cognitive functions. So sensory memory tests can help identify subtle cognitive impairments, and it can help distinguish major depressive disorder from other cognitive disorders. Because one of the characteristic symptoms of depression and schizophrenia are difficulties with cognitive functioning. And what's really nice about using sensory memory as a diagnostic tool for neuropsychological disorders is it's very quick in terms of screening. It's non-invasive, and like I said, it can be preemptive, or it can be a very easy tool to implement as far as early detection of a wide variety of disorders. So, one of the last things I wanted to talk about is one of the most persuasive, or one of the most pervasive, rather, myths in psychology, which is the myth of eidetic memory or photographic memory. So, eidetic memory, often popularly referred to as photographic memory, is the supposed ability to recall images, sounds, or objects in extreme detail and with high precision, as if one has taken photographs of the event. However, the concept of eidetic memory, particularly as it is popularly imagined, is generally considered to be a myth for several reasons. So, the first reason is the lack of empirical evidence, right? Um, so, uh, Despite extensive research, scientists have not found conclusive evidence of eidetic memory existing as a distinct superior form of memory. And studies on individuals who claim to have eidetic memory often reveal that their abilities are not significantly different from the enhanced use of mnemonic strategies, right? Or memory enhancing strategies, or above average memory skills, right? The other reason why we call this into question is that memory research shows that recall is inherently reconstructive rather than being photographic, right? So human memory is inherently reconstructive, not reproductive. And this means that our brains do not we don't store and retrieve memories like a camera or a video recorder. Instead, memories are reconstructed from pieces of information and also can be influenced by a number or numerous other factors, right? So we're not pulling a photograph from some sort of storage container in our brain, but rather we're reconstructing events as we believe they have occurred. So, for example, this comes up a lot with flashbulb memories, where people have very highly detailed memories of events that have affected our nation or the world. Right? So people report these flashbulb memories that are incredibly vivid and rich and detailed, but these memories are often fundamentally inaccurate. And the reason is that memory is reconstructive. So we have the initial memory of the event as it actually happened, and then we have reconstructions of the event from the news media, from conversation that we've had with friends and family. And so all of these different sources of information kind of get convoluted together into this kind of reconstructive narrative. So the way that we fundamentally retrieve information would suggest that it's not photographic. So again, characteristics of memory, right, are that it's fundamentally reconstructive. It can be influenced by a number of different things. Memories are also subject to distortion, loss of detail, and influenced by personal biases and external suggestions, which contradicts the idea of a perfect photographic recall of anything. As far as characteristics of true eidetic memory, that suggests that it's short-lived and rare. So true eidetic memory, if it exists, is extremely rare, and it tends to be more common in children than in adults. And even among those who report eidetic memory abilities, the vividness of the recalled images typically fade very quickly, and they're often within seconds to maybe minutes, right? And they're gone. So these individuals do not recall details with the performance and accuracy that would be expected of a photographic memory. So memories are prone to distortion and fading. Alternative explanations for um, for uh, um, for photographic or eidetic memory is that exceptional memory skills can be attributed to practice or mnemonic techniques, right? So the same kind of techniques that you would utilize to, for example, remember 80 different digits from pi or whatever, you can use to create the illusion of a photographic memory. Um, and also there are certain disorders that can sort of vaguely resemble eidetic memory. So, for example, synesthesia is the ability to experience stimuli in different senses. And that can sometimes lead to exceptional memory performance. Um, so, for example, being able to not only see a number, but also sort of taste a number or to see a particular color associated with a sound, that would be synesthesia. And because with synesthesia, you have a representation of a memory in multiple senses, that can often lead to enhanced performance, but that still isn't considered true photographic or eidetic memory. Okay. All right, so that concludes our discussion of sensory memory. I would encourage you to reach out to me if you have any questions about any of the material. Reach out to me during my office hours or send me an email, and I would love to chat with you. And I hope you have a great day.